Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This should be the 113th video in our Master Series and the 10th video in our mixing phase. So basically, after the last video, we touched on a couple concepts because basically the concept of mixing is pretty simple. What we didn't address was, putting things in their place in a moving stereo field. Because basically, let's say that I'm working on this bus. Let's pretend that this is the bus off of any instrument. Does that make sense? And for the chorus, that it's panned off here to right 75. And so basically I want to pan it off to left 75 here by either adjusting it it's a simple fact, a way of adjusting it. Sometimes you can adjust it off your buses like that. If you have a group like that you're going to adjust like that, sometimes you might have to go to your individual tracks like that and adjust the panning itself from those individual tracks to try to adjust the panning. If you have the panning set for one certain way for those individual tracks on, for the chorus, but you've got this other movement here that you're going to set them over here, then it's a pretty simple process. I mean, the process of moving them around a little bit is pretty simple. Unless you've got something that's going on like this. Like you've got some kind of, it's going to change over here like that. That's going to be a gradient that's going to slowly move off to the other side or something like that. Just really get to know your automation tools. This should have been done before we got into mixing, but we really didn't look at it. There's not really much to look at, when you're dealing with your pannings and spatializations, that for the most part, that you've got it laid out before we ever got into doing any mixing, and you've laid out where things are at. So basically, for the most part, that will normally boil down to, a good example of that is I've got, my spatialization set up for the chorus. I've written it out for the break and things like that. So most of the time that will have been dealt with in our groups, for the most part. So it's one of those kind of things that I normally do first before I do anything else, because a lot of times that the issue here is that, let's say in my subgroups in this mix, that I've really set out all these guitars and the basses and the harmonies and the strings and the piano and the synths and the drums, and everything's been panned out where it's supposed to be. When you look at a mix, that basically you think, okay, well, that's done. I've set it and arranged it, right? Well, in a moving stereo field, it doesn't really work that way, because basically you have to go in there and say, okay, well, for this intro, let's say this is the intro, and for the intro, this needs to be here. The harmonies or whatever, this instrument needs to be set, there, and this instrument needs to be set there, and then you move on to the next movement. If you lay out your movements really well, and then you go in there, then it needs to be set here for this movement. It needs to be set where, for this other movement, and so on and so forth, and just laying it out. Sometimes it's a little bit tedious and things like that, and but it will help you come out with a much better mix if you look at, not only do you need to do your mixing that way of your normal mix that way for your volume levels, but also for your panning. That way, you've basically gone through, before you started mixing levels, and did all this automation work for where things are supposed to be mixed. You can either do it off the bus for some groups, or for individual tracks. You should have individual tracks. So sometimes you've got more than two tracks that are going to change. So it's like you've got these two tracks, these two vocals that are panned, to certain areas for the verse. They're 50-50 right, or 75-75 right. And then for this other part, they're going to go, out 100 right and left. Or you're going to have more. Does that make sense? You might even have to where you even might have three tracks. So then, for this one part, you've got, you don't have the whole vocal here, but just for this verse part that you've gone through, and you've got just this part here, so that for the the first verse, you don't have any of that, but for the chorus, you've got this center and then this off and right. And it's not 75 right and left where it was here. It's, 50 right and left, or 100% right, or 95 right and left. I steer clear of 100 right and left unless there's just like a lot of stuff in the mix. And this is centered. You really need to just spend the time before you start mixing levels and going through each different section and laying out what's going on. So just like we did when we're doing mixing levels, do the same kind of a procedure for your panning. Go through there. It's kind of hard to listen to it sometimes without doing the volume automation first. So basically it's a rough draft. So you're going to go through there and do all that type of work, making sure things are panned where they're supposed to be for, first sections, for certain sections, where you want them, and for other sections, pan differently, and doing automation on those so that the panning on those automation, the panning automation for those is done differently. And it's just a matter of, going through it and setting it up. Now, once you've basically laid it out pretty well, we went through it in subgroup mixing. And when you're going through it in subgroup mixing, you probably should have done this also for your individual tracks, because they'll have a bus coming off them also. And, that rough draft that you get, when you start mixing levels, that the next thing is, let's say you get done with the chorus. So when you go through the chorus and you're doing all those mixing levels, that you're also at the very end of it, before you've mixed you've mixed the vocals, right? We did the mixing of the levels, the audio, the volume levels, and then you went to harmonies. When you get done mixing in those levels of harmonies, then really sit down, listen to the panning. What's happening with the panning? Is that panning working well now? Or do I need to go into the automation of the panning and say, no, now it sounds like that should be out there? Okay, and then I come back to here and check that, depending on that, okay, okay, and then I'm moving on to the guitar. Then I get the level set of that, and then I go back and listen to the panning. Okay, how's the panning of that sound? Does the panning of that sound good? No, I got to change that a little bit. I like it down there. Do I need to change this? I got to go up. Now maybe I want the vocals panned a little bit different. I want the harmonies maybe panned a little bit different, or the individual tracks or whatever. Back to the guitar. Now how does it sound? Okay, do I need to change that back? Does that sound good now? The pan, see, that's the kind of, it's kind of a messed up thing, because they work so much together to make a mix come out sounding well, that them being off a little bit, all the things we talked about, that this is integral also. So you have to add that in your step procedure, that after you get done doing what we've talked about so far, that you also, let's say, as you go through it, make a note. You get through with that, you go to the harmonies, you're done mixing the levels, and then check the pannings. Now, go back to how does the vocal sound? Now, which the vocals are a little bit like there or there. And then the harmonies are like that. And then think about where you got things in your place. Look at the thing you got written out, so you don't change things all up, because you might have to pull out your paper and you go, now I'm redrawing it. Now, no, I want the vocals here at 75 right and left, and I want this one center, and I want this one off the left. That means I'm going to have to change this bass one. I'll wait till I get to it. I'll make a note. It can sound complicated, but some mixing engineers, they just don't get paid big bucks, because they just go in there and push a knob up and down and then smoke a big old fat cigar and have a glass of sherry or something. They don't really spend the time fussing with that stuff. And it's part of their step procedure, and even they're doing a really good job. As you get better, you will find you thinking about it becomes more, like brushing your teeth, but until it does, get it worked in your procedure. So as you go through there, that you do that also with your automation of your panning, because a better production, if it's just static all the way through, it's not as interesting. You move things around sometimes, change the panning of changes the sound. Does that make sense? And can add interest. And sometimes there's different instruments in different sections, so you have to change it a little bit. So what you set up before you started mixing levels is a rough draft. and you basically think you got it, which may be fine. You may not adjust it at all. Sometimes you might adjust it a lot. Does that make sense? And you may find yourself, once you get used to doing it, you might go in there and go, you know, it'd be really cool to right here in the vocals if I just moved them in. And I did this thing with the harmonies out there, and then, or that guitar over there. And now you're starting to fine tune it like you did with the volume automation, some panning things happening that are causing some really different effects to happen that make it sound a little bit different. That will sound interesting, because if you don't do stupid, really drastic things, except for like breaks and transitions that are supposed to, you know, catch the listener, or stuff during a hook, you know, during the hook of the song, you might rechange some of the pannings, you know, and you're starting to get really used to unit automation. You go, no, I'm putting my panning there just for there because I had it sit there, but now I do that little thing right there, really cool. And then here I moved it out, you know, I moved it out there a little bit, and then all of a sudden you come out of this really, you know, trippy, you know, thing for the smooth. It can get complicated, you know, but just remember that's okay, because they're great tools to make you, you know, have an artistic statement as far as an audio engineer. But just remember, don't get so wrapped up in it thinking you got to do really wild stuff all the time. Otherwise, your mix is going to sound out like crap, because a lot of times you keep things pretty basic, and the actual composition is supposed to be what's catching the listener. You're just supposed to accent it and make it sound as good as possible. But sometimes you can have some artistic input in it. Just be careful whose toes you step on in the band, or who's producing the album if it's not your own stuff. But you just add that into your step procedure, so you do the same thing. After you get done, then you go through and check your panning. You've done that, then you go through, check your panning on that, check your panning on vocals, then you've gone off to guitar. You've done the levels on it, and you've gone through all that 3 steps forward, 1 steps back, and then you go through and check out the panning. How's the panning sound? Is that going to sound good? Does it sound good? Do I need to adjust it a little bit? Do I need to make some changes? I want the vocals to be there now. The harmony's here. The guitar, maybe I think I want over there a little bit. Now that sounds a little bit better. Put on your headphones, listen to your monitors, and make notes, you know, because it might change up what you're doing, but make it part of your step procedure whenever you're doing your automation, when you're mixing, because that might fly what you did at first, but it might not, and it might cause you to really look at, you have the ability to change it on the fly like that and do all kinds of cool stuff that can make your mix even better. Just be careful that you don't get wrapped up in it to where you die in front of your mixing board doing a bunch of stuff that nobody's ever even going to be able to hear, that they can't perceive. If it's not perceivable, then don't fuss with it, because if you can't hear it and it's not making a statement, then it's not doing any good. It's just wasting your time. So just kind of keep that in mind. So anyway, add that in your step procedure while you're going through when you're mixing, and go through it and look at it the same way as when we're doing levels, and kind of follow that 3 steps forward, 1 step back, you know, going through it with your mixing of your levels, so that when you get done with your levels and you're done with that, and you're done on the guitar, then go back and look at your panning, you know, and look at it. Okay, how's that there? And then go back to the out front vocals and listen to that, make sure, and then go that step, and then guitar. Okay, I'm done. Bam. Now I'm on to mixing the audio levels for the bass, and then when I get done with doing that procedure, I go back and do that same procedure, thinking about the panning. And you will find that at first it may seem like a lot, but your mixes will come out sounding so much better. So I hope you enjoyed this short series on mixing, and I do believe in the next video we're going to get into doing processing on the whole mix, because at this time, that if you've done a really good job and taken your time to take into consideration the things I've talked about, that you should have a pretty good sounding mix at this point, except for one key factor. We are going to go through and talk about the leveling bus, so we might as well do that right now. What I use the leveling bus for. The leveling bus, I have this procedure that once I've gone through my mix, that this is to fine tune my mixing. So let's take a look at that in the next video. See you there.